It was the summer of 1973 when 24-year-old Nina Cross found her inheritance buried under 7,000 pounds of someone else's garbage. The farm wasn't much, just a stretch of central Florida soil her father had loved more than he'd loved profit. But it was hers now. It was a quiet legacy of sandy loam/pines and the thick, humid air that promised rain every afternoon. The day the first truck arrived, she was on the back porch trying to decipher her father's meticulous but cryptic notes on soil pH. The sound was a violation, a grinding of gears and the pneumatic hiss of air brakes where only the drone of cicadas belonged. She walked toward the fence line, wiping her hands on her jeans, and watched as the tailgate of a massive hauling truck, emblazoned with the logo of the new citrus processing plant next door, swung open. A torrent of pale orange and yellow rinds, slick with pulp and dripping with sour-smelling juice, cascaded onto her land. It wasn't a spill. It was a deliberate, roaring expulsion. The peels fanned out, covering a 50-foot swath of her fallow field in a matter of seconds. Then the truck's engine roared back to life, and it pulled away, leaving behind a steaming, fragrant wound on the earth. She stood there for a long time, unable to process the sheer audacity of it. The next morning, another truck came, and the morning after that. Within a week, a corner of her property had been transformed into a landfill, a mountain of citrus waste, buzzing with flies and beginning to ferment under the relentless sun. The neighbors, good people who had known her father for 30 years, came by. They shook their heads, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and a kind of grim satisfaction that this problem wasn't theirs. "You've got to do something, Nina," one of them, Mr. Gable, said, his voice low. "They can't just do this." They saw a young woman, barely out of girlhood, alone on a farm that was already a struggle to keep. They saw a victim. They saw ruined land, a legal battle she couldn't afford, and a future of blight. Now, let me tell you about the men who ran that plant. They were not local. They were part of a corporation from up north, men in crisp shirts who saw the Florida landscape not as a home, but as a resource grid. When Nina drove her father's old pickup to the plant's administrative office, a sterile, air-conditioned box plopped down amidst the steam and noise, she was met with the kind of polite indifference that is more insulting than open hostility. She was made to wait for nearly an hour before a man named Mr. Henderson would see her. He had a smooth, unlined face and the weary posture of a man for whom problems like hers were a tedious but routine part of the day. She explained the situation calmly, directly. She told him about the trucks, the peels, the violation of her property line. Mr. Henderson leaned back in his chair, a leather throne that sighed under his weight. He steepled his fingers. "Miss Cross," he began, his tone patient, as if explaining a complex concept to a child. "We have an arrangement, an understanding." "An understanding with whom?" Nina asked. "My father passed away 6 months ago. I assure you he made no such arrangement with me, and I am the owner." "It was an informal agreement with the previous foreman of this property," he said, the lie slipping out so easily it was clear he believed it himself. "A mutually beneficial disposal protocol. We have excess organic material. Your field is fallow. It's biodegradable. Good for the soil in the long run. It is my land," she stated. It was a simple sentence, but it held the weight of her entire world. "And you are dumping industrial waste on it without my permission. I want it to stop, and I want it cleaned up." He smiled then, a thin, dismissive curl of the lips, It was the smile of a man who held all the cards. "Cleaned up? Miss Cross, that's thousands of tons of material. The cost would be prohibitive. Look, let's be reasonable. We're a new business here. We're providing jobs, a little inconvenience for a neighbor. It's part of being in a community." He saw her youth, her solitary state, and made a calculation. He calculated that she was powerless. He was right in the way that men with lawyers and capital are always right against people with nothing but a deed and a sense of justice. He offered to pay her a pittance, a leasing fee as he called it, of $50 a month. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an insult wrapped in paperwork. She stood up. "The dumping will stop," she said again, her voice quiet but unwavering. "I'm afraid that's not possible," he replied, already turning his attention to a stack of papers on his desk. The meeting was over. She walked out of that cold office and back into the humid Florida heat, the dismissal stinging more than the injustice. The men in that office, the skeptical neighbors, the whole world, it seemed, had looked at her and seen only a problem. They saw a quiet girl and a field of trash. They couldn't have been more wrong, because what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was who her father was. Now, let me explain. Her father, Arthur Cross, was a farmer, yes, but that was like calling a watchmaker a man who works with gears. It was technically true, but missed the entire point. Arthur had been a chemical engineer before he inherited the farm, a man who had traded a laboratory for a field, but had never lost his scientist's mind. He saw the world not just as dirt and seeds, but as a series of intricate chemical reactions. He didn't just grow crops. He managed a complex ecosystem of nitrogen cycles, microbial life, and solar energy conversion. His barn wasn't filled with dusty almanacs. It was lined with textbooks, organic chemistry, fluid dynamics, botany, thermodynamics. His handwritten journals were not simple records of rainfall and planting dates. They were filled with complex formulas, observations on soil composition, and sketches of distillation apparatus. He had taught Nina to see the world his way. He hadn't taught her with lectures, but with shared work and quiet questions. While other fathers taught their daughters to bake, Arthur had taught Nina the Maillard reaction that made the crust of bread brown. When they fixed the old tractor, he explained the principles of internal combustion. And when they walked the fields, he would crush a leaf between his fingers, hold it to her nose, and explain the volatile organic compounds she was smelling. "Everything is giving something away, Nina," he used to say, his voice a low rumble. "The trick is knowing what it is and whether it's worth catching." His core philosophy was simple. Waste was a failure of imagination. He believed that every byproduct, every leftover, every piece of trash was simply a raw material for a process you hadn't discovered yet. When Nina returned from Mr. Henderson's office, feeling the familiar sting of helplessness, she didn't go to a lawyer. She didn't call the county commissioner. She went to her father's library in the small, dusty room off the main barn. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dry soil. She ran her fingers over the spines of the books. Principles of mass transfer, the chemistry of terpenes, industrial distillation processes. She pulled one out, a heavy tome bound in dark green cloth. It was a college textbook on organic chemistry from the 1950s. She opened it, and inside, tucked into the chapter on esters and aromatic compounds, was a sheaf of her father's notes, written in his precise, angular script. "Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever been faced with a problem so large it feels like a physical weight? A mountain you can't possibly move? And in that moment of despair, have you found a key, a single, simple idea that doesn't move the mountain, but instead reveals that the mountain itself is made of gold? That is what happened to Nina Cross in that dusty barn. As she read her father's notes, the world outside shifted. The oppressive, sour smell of the rotting peels in her field was no longer the smell of decay. It was the smell of limonene, of pine, of citral. It was the smell of volatile essential oils gassing off into the humid air, a treasure being squandered with every passing moment. Her father had underlined a specific passage about cold press extraction, a mechanical process for releasing oils without heat. In the margins, he had sketched a design for a simple screw press and written a note. Purity is a function of freshness. The shorter the time from peel to press, the higher the grade of the oil. Commercial processes lose 40% of the most volatile compounds due to transport and storage lag. And then she saw it. The secret. The key. The men at the plant saw the peels as waste, a costly byproduct to be disposed of as quickly and cheaply as possible. The cosmetic and fragrance companies who bought citrus oils typically bought them from processors who used peels that were days or even weeks old, that had been shipped, stored, and dried. The resulting oil was a commodity, useful but not exceptional. But the peels being dumped on her land were fresh. They were coming directly from the juicing machines, sometimes still warm, their cellular structures perfectly intact. The corporation, in its arrogant carelessness, was delivering the highest quality raw material imaginable directly to her doorstep, for free. They weren't just dumping trash. They were delivering a daily harvest of unmatched chemical purity. A slow smile spread across Nina's face. It was the first time she had truly smiled since her father's passing. She would not fight Mr. Henderson. She would not beg him to stop. She would let him keep coming. She would let him bury her in his treasure. The subsequent 2 years were a masterclass in patience and solitary labor. Her life became a singular focus. She sold a small parcel of land on the far side of the property, a plot her father had always said was poor for planting, to get a small amount of capital. She didn't buy a new tractor or fix the sagging roof on the farmhouse. She bought a used industrial screw press from a defunct olive oil operation in Georgia. She bought stainless steel food-grade drums. She spent weeks in the barn with her father's books, a welding torch and scavenged copper tubing, building a rudimentary but functional steam distiller based on a diagram she'd found in a chemical engineering manual. The work was brutal. Every morning before the sun had burned off the morning mist, she was out in the field with a wheelbarrow, gathering the freshest of the peels from the top of the pile dumped the day before. The work was sticky, acidic, and backbreaking. The sharp citrus oil stung the cuts on her hands. The smell, once a nuisance, was now the constant atmosphere of her life, clinging to her hair, her clothes, the very wood of her house. The neighbors watched her, their pity slowly curdling into confused suspicion. They saw her not hauling the peels away, but hauling them into her barn. The whispers started in the feed store and the post office. That Cross girl's gone round the bend. Trying to make moonshine out of orange peels, I hear. The grief must have gotten to her. Their skepticism was a wall she simply chose not to see. She didn't have time for it. There were moments of profound doubt. One night, deep in the second winter, a key bearing on the press seized. She had been working for 18 hours straight, and she was covered in a sticky film of pulp and oil. Exhausted, broke, and overwhelmed by the Sisyphean task she had set for herself, she slumped against the cold metal of the machine and wept. The thought of giving up, of selling the farm and walking away from the mountain of rotting fruit, was a sweet temptation. In that moment of weakness, she went into the house and opened her father's main journal, the one he kept on his bedside table. On the first page, in his strong, clear hand, he had written a quote from an old Stoic philosopher. "The obstacle is the way." She read it over and over. Mr. Henderson was an obstacle. The mountain of peels was an obstacle. Her own exhaustion was an obstacle. She went back to the barn, fired up the torch, and spent the rest of the night rebuilding the bearing. The first sign of success was not a mountain of money. It was a single, small, glass vial. After her first successful steam distillation of the cold-pressed slurry, she was left with a tiny amount of clear, shimmering liquid. It was the essential oil. She opened the vial, and the scent that emerged was nothing like the sour smell in the field. It was the pure, concentrated essence of sunshine. It was the smell of an orange blossom and a ripe fruit combined. A scent so powerful and clean it was almost shocking. It was life, concentrated into a drop. She knew in that instant that her father had been right. She had captured lightning in a bottle. She began small. She took her samples not to the large distributors, but to small artisanal businesses. An elderly woman in St. Augustine who made expensive hand-milled soaps. A boutique perfumery in Miami, known for its all-natural ingredients. Their reactions were immediate and overwhelming. They had never encountered citrus oils of this quality. The soap maker found her soaps held their scent 3 times longer. The perfumer discovered that Nina's oil could be used as a top note without the harsh, chemical after scent of commercial oils. It was, he said, alive. They didn't just want to buy her oil. They wanted to buy all of it. And they were willing to pay a premium far beyond the market rate. The price they offered for 1 gallon of her pure, cold-pressed orange oil was more than she made in an entire year from the farm's meager soybean crop. The tide had turned. Every dollar she made went back into the operation. She replaced the salvaged copper with a custom-built stainless steel still. She bought a second, more powerful press. She hired a local boy, the son of one of the very neighbors who had pitied her, to help with the hauling. Within 4 years, the corner of her farm was no longer a dump. It was a humming, efficient, and surprisingly clean outdoor factory. The peels arrived each morning, were processed by midday, and by evening, the distilled oils were resting in sealed drums, and the leftover pulp was being composted into the richest, most fertile soil the county had ever seen. The land remembered. The very ground that had been treated as a wasteland was now being healed and enriched by the process. The whispers in town changed again. Pity had become curiosity, and curiosity had become a grudging respect. The sight of shipping trucks, not from the citrus plant, but from cosmetic and pharmaceutical companies, rumbling down the lane to Nina's farm became commonplace. She was no longer poor Nina Cross. She was Miss Cross, a woman of business, an enigma who had somehow turned a blight into a boon. She paid off the farm's mortgage. She bought her father's old truck a new engine. She lived simply, but she was no longer struggling. She was thriving. Then, in the fall of 1978, nearly 5 years after the first truck had dumped its load, a sleek company sedan pulled up her driveway. Mr. Henderson got out. He was older, His face was more lined, and the easy confidence he had worn like a suit had been replaced by something more cautious. He had been hearing things. His own company's commodity-grade citrus oil was facing price pressure, while rumors of a small local producer of unbelievably high-grade oils were reaching the ears of his buyers. It had taken him a surprisingly long time to connect the genius local producer with the quiet girl whose farm he was using as a dump. He walked over to where Nina was supervising the loading of a shipment. He took in the sight of the efficient machinery, the clean workspace, the sheer scale of her operation. His face was a mask of disbelief. This was not some backyard hobby. This was a serious enterprise. "Miss Cross," he said, his voice strained. She turned to face him, wiping her hands on a clean rag. She did not smile. She simply waited. I see you've been busy," he stammered, gesturing vaguely at the entire operation. "I have," she said. He cleared his throat, the corporate mask sliding back into place. "Look," he said, trying to sound like the man in charge again. "There's obviously been a misunderstanding over the years. We've been looking to partner with a local supplier for high-grade essential oils. It seems like a natural fit. Our supply, your expertise." He was trying to frame it as an opportunity for her, a partnership. This was the moment, the culmination of 5 years of solitary work, of being underestimated and dismissed. She could have been angry. She could have been vindictive. But her father had also taught her that the best negotiations are conducted quietly. "How did you do it?" he finally asked, the question breaking through his corporate poise. It was a genuine question. He looked at the mountain of peels, the same waste his engineers told him was a disposal nightmare, and then at the barrels of valuable oil being loaded onto the truck. He could not make the equation balance in his head. "How did you know?" Nina looked past him, toward the barn where her father's books still sat on their shelves. "You saw trash," she said, her voice even and calm. "My father taught me to see raw materials. You were in a hurry. My father taught me the value of patience. That's all." "We want to formalize the arrangement," Mr. Henderson pressed, getting back to business. "A long-term contract. We'll provide the peels exclusively, and you'll provide us with the oil at a preferred rate." Nina looked him directly in the eye. The quiet, dismissed girl was gone. In her place was the master of this domain, a woman who had built an empire out of his ignorance. "Let me be very clear, Mr. Henderson. There is no arrangement. There is no partnership. For 5 years, your company has been dumping its industrial waste on my property, illegally. I have been, in effect, providing you with free waste disposal. That ends today." His face paled. "What do you mean?" "From now on," she continued, "you will no longer be dumping. You will be delivering. You will deliver a minimum of 5 tons of fresh peels daily to my specifications. They will be free of leaf and stem contaminants. You will deliver them on a schedule I set. In exchange for this raw material, I will not sue your company for 5 years of illegal dumping and environmental damage. That is the deal." "But we won't get any of the oil?" he asked, incredulous. "No," Nina said, "you won't. And we have to deliver it for free." "You have it backwards," she corrected him gently. "I am providing you with a valuable service, waste disposal. My fee for this service is your entire daily output of citrus peels. If you find that fee too high, you are welcome to find another place to dump them." I hear the county landfill charges by the ton." He stood there, utterly defeated. He was a man who moved numbers around on a ledger, who dealt in contracts and leverage. He had no leverage here. She had taken his single biggest liability and turned it into her single greatest asset. He had come to negotiate a supply chain and had walked into a checkmate he hadn't seen coming for 5 years. He looked at her, at the quiet confidence in her eyes, and finally he understood. He had not been dealing with a farmer. He had been dealing with a scientist. "I will have to speak to my board," he mumbled. "You do that," Nina said, turning back to her work. The conversation was over. She had set every term. The narrative, of course, jumps forward from there. The corporation, faced with the staggering cost of trucking their waste hundreds of miles or building their own processing facility, agreed to all of her terms. The daily delivery of peels became a formal, contractual obligation. Nina's company, Cross Aromatics, grew from a one-woman operation into a respected leader in the natural ingredients industry. She never took on debt. She expanded slowly, organically, using the profits from her oils to buy the best equipment, hire the best people, and fund research into new extraction techniques for other botanicals. Decades later, Nina Cross was a respected elder, a quiet matriarch of an industry she had helped create. Her farm was a marvel, a perfect blend of sustainable agriculture and cutting-edge science. The processing facility, a sleek building of glass and steel, stood on the exact spot where the first load of peels had been dumped so many years ago. It was a monument to her father's wisdom, and she was never alone in it. She was always teaching, always passing on the knowledge. She could often be found with her grandniece, a young woman with her own sharp, inquisitive eyes, standing not in a boardroom but in the old barn, the heavy green chemistry textbook open on the workbench between them. She would pass her father's journal into the young woman's hands, the pages worn soft with time. The story of Nina Cross became a quiet legend in that part of the state. A story about patience, about seeing what others missed. The men in their crisp shirts thought they could bury a small farm under their carelessness. They thought their problem could become her problem. They never understood the simple truth her father had taught her. They thought they were dumping their waste, but what they were really doing was delivering the seeds of their own irrelevance right to the door of the one person on earth who knew exactly what to do with them. The land remembered the injury, but it rewarded the one who knew how to heal it.